So welcome everyone. This is negotiation strategies for first-gen graduate students and postdocs. So what are we going to talk about today? We are going to talk about when can you negotiate? When might you want to negotiate? And when might you think about, well, this is a good enough offer and I don't need to negotiate. We're going to talk about the how of negotiation. We are going to talk about what else you can negotiate besides your salary. And then we are going to share some general resources around negotiation with all of you.
When can you negotiate? Before we even get into the when you might negotiate, I think it's first important to talk about why you might choose to negotiate. Most times when you're with a company for a prolonged period of time, you will be getting annual pay raises. These can be merit-based. They could also be based on factors such as cost of living, and things like that. Your future pay raises are going to be based on your starting salary. So if you accept a starting salary of say $50,000 and then you're getting a 5% pay raise in a year, right? That's going to be 5% of that starting salary. So the higher you negotiate that initial salary that you accept, the higher your future pay raises will be. So I think that is one good reason to really think about negotiating up even slightly from an initial offer that you're presented with to ensure that your future pay raises are also going to be a bit higher there. Another thing to consider is that for a lot of companies, your retirement benefits can depend on your base salary. So many companies will take, at the time that you would retire, an average of salaries that you have earned over the given years that you've been with that company. So to have a higher base salary to start out with is going to bring that overall average up and therefore lend to a higher retirement package. Another thing that I've touched upon a bit is that salary negotiations will have a compounding effect over time. So if you bring up that base salary when you're starting out and accepting a job offer, your future raises will be higher based on how high you can get that initial salary up. So a lot of times when I'm working with students and alums who are thinking through the negotiation part, I always do tend to focus a bit on that salary piece because it has such ramifications for the future in terms of both earnings and retirement potential. You do not need to negotiate. That's okay. You don't have to. But I do think that a large majority of employers are expecting applicants to negotiate at some point in the process. So whether that's negotiating the salary itself or other benefits that are included in the package, a lot of employers are expecting some negotiation. So what that can mean is that the initial offer that you're presented with might not be their best and final offer. So I think there's always room to ask and to see if there is any wiggle room to come up a bit from what was initially presented to you as an applicant. Now that you have thought a little bit about why you might negotiate, the next thing to think about is when in the process of being an applicant do you want to start the negotiation process? We usually advise that it is best to negotiate once you have an offer in writing. A lot of times there will be a verbal offer presented, and that's great to see if you're in the right ballpark. And then after the verbal offer is presented, an employer will generally pull together a written offer package and send that to you via email. At the time that you get that written offer package, that's when it's great to begin the negotiation process because that will usually include details in addition to salary, which will usually be conveyed over the phone, but things like your benefits package, retirement plans, there are stock options or anything like that. All of those little details will be included in the written offer. So wait until you have all of the information in front of you so you can evaluate and start to think about what points you might want to negotiate moving forward. Also think about really negotiating only if you're interested in accepting that position. Sometimes you'll be presented with an offer that just feels so far away from what you're looking at, or just throughout the course of the interview process, you've realized this isn't a good fit. Even if I'm offered that job, I don't plan to accept it. Negotiating is a lot of work on both ends. And so if this is really something that you don't think has any way to meet your expectations for a job, you can always just politely decline rather than trying to negotiate something that you have no intention to ultimately accept. And then another thing, don't accept an offer before negotiating. It can be so tempting to respond right away. Thank you so much. I'd love to accept. But we really advise that you really think through, is there anything in that offer that is not agreeable to you? And negotiating before you give a verbal or written acceptance.
So now that Patty has given you all a great sense of when you might want to negotiate, let's talk about the how. How might you go about approaching the conversation? What are some of the things to think about? A lot of times when you're applying to jobs, you might see that on the application, job application itself, it is becoming increasingly common to ask candidates, what is your expected salary? So candidates often might feel like, oh, I'm already like being forced to share what I'm expecting in terms of salary. Our advice in terms of the job application piece either is to try and see in the application if you can type negotiable in words. If the form will not accept any word entry and will only accept numbers, try to provide a range. And how do you come up with a range? You really have to do a lot of research. Look up what are the market standards, what do people typically make, and there are a lot of variables, right? So a company that is paying 100K in New York might be paying a very different number in Kansas City. So you have to take all of these factors into consideration when you're doing your research. In a bit, we'll also talk about what are some specific resources that you can utilize in doing some of your research. A lot of times, questions around salary and compensation might come up during the interviews. When somebody is interviewing, you're often like feeling very nervous, anxious. If a question like that comes up, what do? How do you handle the situation? Instead of answering and giving a number, you can always reverse the question and ask the interviewer, what do you think would be a fair compensation for the kind of role in this kind of a geographic location, for the kinds of roles and the responsibilities? Another strategy that you can utilize is, again, to answer with a range rather than a specific number. Be prepared to be able to answer this question in interviews. It might come up, particularly if you're, it's usually doesn't come up during the first stage of interviews, but if you're like a finalist or if you've gone through a couple of rounds of interviews, be prepared to answer this question. Don't be caught off guard if an interviewer is asking you questions about your salary expectations, but also don't feel like you have to answer with a number, otherwise you're blowing your chances. So in terms of preparation, there is quite a bit you need to do before you are at the negotiation table, so to say, right? And the preparation phase starts even before you have applied for the role. While you're still in graduate school, look at job posts. Look at what are a lot of job posts nowadays have salaries posted with them, particularly like certain states, like in New York, there's a lot of push around salary transparency. So they are trying to make salaries, they're trying to post salaries with job postings. So look up what are some of those numbers. There is tons of other resources. So for every federal employee, you can look up what those salary ranges are. So for example, if you were to apply for a postdoc role at the University of Connecticut, you can look up what postdocs typically make at the University of Connecticut. What about assistant professor? You can do the same things. You can look up all of those federal salaries. If you were to go work for a government agency, you can find their salaries online. So do that research beforehand to get a sense of what the market standard is, what are some typical compensation packages. Keep in mind that salaries can vary quite a bit. So even for people doing the same kinds of jobs, if you're in very different sectors, your salaries there can be a huge variability in your salary. So if you're, for example, a business analyst working for a public health organization, and you're a business analyst working for a big tech, there might be a huge difference. If just because you're working as a business analyst, the two salaries might not be comparable. So bear that in mind when you're doing your research. Other things that often play into the salary are things like location. Location is a big factor. The size of the organization, right? If you're at an organization which is like a smaller startup, and you're comparing your salary to something that's a large established organization, they might not always be comparable. Other things that really factor into determining the salary is oftentimes experience, right? So if somebody is working as, to keep on using the example before, business analyst who has had 10 years of experience doing exactly that kind of work, and somebody else is like an entry-level position, it might not be fair to compare those two salaries. So take all of these things holistically into account when you're doing your research and come up with a fair number. Another great strategy for doing your research in advance and preparing for salary negotiation is through informational interviewing. If you're not familiar with informational interviewing is basically reaching out to somebody who is a professional in any career that's of interest to you and speaking to them and trying to gather some information and knowledge about that particular career sector. At Penn Career Services, we have a great resource around informational interviewing for graduate students and postdocs. It's on our webpage. So if you haven't had a chance to look at it, please do check it out. So when you're doing these informational interviews, you can ask questions around salaries. Obviously, you would not be asking the person like, what kind of salary do you make? That would make them awkward, right? Don't do that. But you can ask them questions like, what does an entry-level position, what does somebody in an entry-level position typically make in this role? You can ask them, what does a typical compensation package look like in this kind of role, in this kind of career sector? You can ask questions around, are salaries negotiable in this sector? So why that's important is that there are certain career sectors in which you can't really negotiate much. So for example, government salaries, there are salary bands, and they basically can offer you, if they hire you at level A, they can only offer you whatever is within the band of level A, right? So you can only negotiate that much. Similarly for consulting, they might start out all of their advanced degree consultants at the same level. So there really isn't much of a room to negotiate in consulting often. So those are just to give you a couple of examples around like industry specific norms and standards around negotiation. So it's very, very important to like do this kind of information and gathering, because it's best to do this when you're speaking to a person to get a sense of what is the norm in that particular career sector. In addition to all of this, it's important to assess and evaluate your own value. Think about, what are you bringing to the table in terms of your skills, in terms of your experience, in terms of your industry-specific knowledge, and try to equate that and try to see what that translates to in terms of an industry standard, a market value. So let's say now you have received an offer. Yay, very exciting times, right? One of the first things you want to do is express your enthusiasm and thank the people. Say that you're very excited to be receiving this offer. Patty touched upon this a little bit. When you get an offer, it's so exciting. You might be really tempted to say, yes, I love it, I accept it. But resist that temptation and don't accept immediately. What you might want to say instead is, I'm so excited. Thank you so much for the offer. I would love to take a look at the details of the offer and really understand it. And then I would like to schedule some time to speak and discuss the offer details, right? That really gives you enough time to actually look at additional things beyond the salary, right? Because there might be a lot of other things that really factor into the overall compensation package, shares, stocks, etc., depending on the industry and depending on the kind of work you'll be doing. When you're evaluating the offer, and I'll touch in a little bit more detail around how you can evaluate an offer, but when you're evaluating an offer, keep the totality of your circumstances in mind. Take into account, do you have another interview lined up? Is this job a good fit? Does this job offer you to do the things that you really want to do, and to what extent? Evaluate all of those things and then ask yourself, are you still interested in accepting the position? If you are, it makes sense to continue to negotiate. If you're not, you might want to decline the offer instead of negotiating. If you have, Patty talked about this, if you have no desire whatsoever of accepting an offer, Don't go through the motions of negotiating just for the sake of it. If you know you're not going to accept it anyway, you're like, whatever. What are some of the things that you might want to think about in terms of evaluating an offer? Of course, you want to first assess, does the job offer align with market standards? And take into account, okay, what does a person typically make in this role with my number of years of experience, with my kind of educational background? A degree in and of itself is oftentimes not just the reason to give somebody more money, right? And we'll talk about this again when we talk about how you might think about approaching the conversation. But think about, is this in the general ballpark of what would be fair value for somebody doing this kind of role in this industry? Does your interests and your values align with the values of that particular team? Do you want to work towards the same goals? Do you have same values around work-life balance, etc.? Take that into consideration. Think about, okay, what is the broader message of this organization? What are some of the things that they have indicated that they value? Do they support diverse voices? Is that important to you? Take into account, go look at their company website and see, okay, what kind of support is provided around diversity or any kinds of things that you care about, really. When you're getting a job offer for the first time, it's very tempting to just think about the salary number, right? But what we want to caution you and let you all know about is that take the job offer into consideration holistically. Think about things beyond the salary number, right? A few things that you might really want to think about in detail are things like professional development opportunities. Because if the job doesn't really have professional development opportunities or opportunities for you to build new skills, you might feel stagnated in that role after a few years. So think about, does this role allow you to go to conferences? Does this offer you the chance to meet new people, build new skills, learn a new and different programming language, write a grant? All of those things can be very important. Also think about career progression. What might the typical career progression look like for somebody in this role, right? Is there a clear path? Is there a ladder? If not, okay, what are some of the things people have gone on to do who previously held this role? These are all things to think about and look into and take into consideration when you're evaluating an offer. So when it's time to negotiate, first of all, you have an offer, great. Build a budget for yourself to assess your own needs. Think about what are some of the things that you absolutely need: rent, mortgage, different kinds of things that are your daily necessities. Think about what are some things that you absolutely need to have. You need to have this to have the kind of lifestyle that you want. And then there are things that would be good to have. So make a distinction between what are some things that are must-haves for you and what are some things that would be good to have, and really hone in on the need to haves. Typically, when a salary is offered to you, it's acceptable to be negotiating 5 to 10% over what is being offered. If somebody is offering you 100K, it probably would be frowned upon if you were to ask for 150K, right? So think about what's a realistic ask. When you're asking for more, no matter what else you're asking for, whether it's salary, whether it's additional flexibility to work remotely, it's always good to have, you want to have compelling reasons to back up why you're asking for more. And like I mentioned previously, just your graduate degree, so a master's degree or a PhD degree, those are often taken into consideration. If your degree is valued in that field, the offer factors that in. So it's oftentimes not just enough to say, I want more money because I have a PhD. You really want to hone in on your skills, the kinds of skills that you're bringing to the table. Do you have any directly related experience? Talk about that. Do you have a deep understanding of that industry? If you do, talk about that. And you really want to demonstrate and provide evidence that you have all of these additional skills that you're going to bring to the negotiation table and talk about as reasons for why they should consider giving you more in terms of compensation. Negotiation is hard, right? Nobody is like, yes, I would love to negotiate, right? Most people are not. And it's hard and it's uncomfortable. And people might want to often try to avoid really having the conversation around negotiation. And it might be tempting to just email and have this exchange in email. Our general advice is don't do that. Try to schedule a time to speak to the person, whoever it is, whether it's the hiring manager, whether it's the HR, schedule a time to speak with them to really discuss the nitty-gritties of the offer. This would also allow you to really showcase your value and really talk about why you want more. And when you're having a conversation, a lot matters, like your intonation matters. So we always recommend speaking to somebody on the phone or via video call if that works out for you. Make sure when you're negotiating, you're not waiting till the final deadline for the negotiation to actually make that ask. When you first offered a salary, you should go and ask for additional time. Don't wait till that time is on, the clock is ticking, because people often have to, like, the deadline that they give, they might need to go back, they might have to go find another candidate. So be considerate of their circumstances if you want them to be considerate of your various circumstances as well. Make the difficult ask first. And what we mean by that is if you're asking for somebody to move the start date, that might be easier for them to accommodate versus if you're asking for more salary. So whatever is the most important thing to you, or whatever seems like the most difficult thing to do, ask that first. Because if you were to ask easier things and say, oh, can you really move my start date? They might say, yeah, sure. And then they have already given you something. And then if you ask for, yeah, by the way, I would also like more in terms of salary. I would also like to go to this conference, and I would like to have an IEEE membership that you all pay for. They can feel like we already sort of give you something, and they can say that we already gave you something that you asked for, right? So whatever is the most important thing for you, ask that first. And that could be anything. If you're an international student, you might want to ask about visa sponsorship and green card things, because those might be the most difficult and important things for you. So again, evaluate your own circumstances, figure out what is the most important thing for you, and use that as a way to guide the conversation.
Next, we'll talk about what are some of those things that you can negotiate. So besides salary, which has already been stressed as the big one, there are a ton of other things that you might consider adding into your negotiation talking points. We have a list on this slide that is fairly extensive. I would generally advise that you're probably not going to negotiate on all of these things for any one offer, right? Hopefully an offer is meeting at least the majority of your expectations to start with. But here are some things that you might want to negotiate if they're not satisfactory conditions for you already. So the first one that you might think about negotiating is relocation costs. If you are applying to positions in a geographic area that's not near to where you are currently, there are going to be moving expenses. Depending on the industry, a lot of times companies will have a pool of funds that they can pull from to assist you in relocating across the country. And that might be used to cover the cost of a moving van or storage, or funding the first couple of months rent in an apartment while you get settled. So those are all different expenses that could fall under that relocation cost category. You also might want to negotiate your job title. If the title proposed feels like it is less senior than you are hoping for, sometimes there's room to negotiate for a different title, right? So if the title has assistant in it and you would like it to be associate, to be able to make that case for why you think you deserve a higher title, why your experience aligns with that, and why the work that you would do in that role would fall within that higher job title, that is also something you might consider negotiating. A start date is another one that, depending on the role, can be easy or tricky to negotiate. A lot of times we will see folks who are graduating in May applying to jobs that start at some point over the summer. But you might want to take some time off. School is exhausting. Maybe you want to travel. Maybe you have plans to visit family. Maybe you just want to have a few weeks to decompress and not jump right into a new job. So if you're offered a position with a June 1st start date, but you would really like to have some time off, you could try to negotiate for a later start date. A lot of times employers won't be able to hold a job indefinitely for you, right? So I would not advise asking to defer a start date by 6 months, right? But to defer by 4 weeks, 6 weeks, I think something like that would feel like a reasonable accommodation to ask for. Another thing you might consider negotiating is parental leave. Depending on the size of the company, they could have already in place a robust parental leave policy. A lot of times for larger employers, that's not something that's going to be negotiable, right? It's going to be written in stone. This is our policy. It applies to everyone across the board. But for some companies that are smaller, they might just have kind of a bare minimum outline of this is the FMLA leave policy. It is what it is sort of thing. And there could be some room in there to say, I would like some clarity around your parental leave policy, or I noticed that your parental leave policy doesn't allow for any paid time off. It's all unpaid time off. Is that something that there's room to negotiate around? So that could be something that, again, depending on the size of the company and the scope of their policy already, you might be able to ask for various negotiation points within that. Remote work options is another thing. So depending on the nature of the work, some work lends itself much easier to remote work than other fields. So if that is something that is important to you, it might be worth a conversation. Some employers will have some flexibility. Some have company-wide policies, others it's really team dependent. So that is something that is great to talk about in a negotiation as well. TT already talked about kind of continuing education. So what are the available options for you to kind of further your professional knowledge? A lot of times companies will be able to pay for various trainings and things like that. So that's something that is also great to get in writing during the offer period. Things like a laptop and mobile phone, will they be provided for you? Are you expected to use your own personal devices for business purposes? A signing bonus or just bonuses in general. A lot of companies might not be able to come up to where you want for salary, say. Maybe they are working on a banding system where they can't offer you more at the level that you're coming in at. But they might have some flexibility to give you a one-time signing bonus that would at least bring your first year a little bit higher for you there. Or they might have some flexibility around annual bonuses that are offered. So if the salary itself can't come up to the level that you're hoping for, but you know that every July you'd be eligible for a $5,000 annual bonus, that is something that could make a salary offer a little bit more appealing to you if you know that there's a bonus that you would be likely to get each year. Things like long-term incentives, such as stock options. Again, this is really industry dependent, but some companies will offer stock options or shares as part of your offer package. So that's another thing to look at kind of side by side with salary to see how that could pan out for you. And then the promotion evaluation. So depending on the company and the role, different organizations have different structures for when and how they will evaluate people for promotion within the company. So to think about, is this something that you only have a chance to talk about once a year at an annual review? Or is this something where your manager would be open to meeting with you every 6 months or every 3 months to talk about performance and promotion? I think this is especially important if you are accepting a role that has a title that is not exactly what you want. If you know that, okay, within 6 months we can meet to discuss kind of promotion to that next level, that could mean a lot in terms of whether you decide to accept or not for an offer. So when you are negotiating, you definitely want to express your enthusiasm for the job. I think it makes the negotiation a lot easier when, as an employer, you're talking with a candidate who you know really wants to be there, right? I think you're more likely to try to make things work when you know that that individual is just as excited as you are. Prioritize what you would like to negotiate and talk about them in that order. So if salary is the big thing for you, lead with that, right? Salary is usually one of the first things that you will negotiate. It's usually the one that is the biggest point for most folks and is one that will come before a lot of the other benefits that you will talk about. You can approach the salary negotiation a couple of different ways, right? So you may start out by asking, is there any flexibility in determining salary? So A lot of times an employer will have a salary range that they're working from. So it's not typical for an employer to generally present an offer that's at the top of their range. Usually you'll be looking at an initial offer kind of in the bottom half or the midpoint of the range. So to hear from an employer if there's room to come up, that could help you to frame kind of what your next ask would be. It's also okay to start that conversation with a particular number if you have something in mind, right? So as TT has said, kind of thinking about 5 to 10% above the initial ask is a great starting point. So if you get that offer of $100,000, but you really wanted it to be 110, it would be totally fine to say, opening that conversation, yeah, is there any flexibility in moving the salary closer to 110,000, all right, to kind of get the ball rolling and throw out a number there to begin the negotiation. And then lastly, when you're thinking about negotiating salary, it's really important to keep your talking points to professional reasons. So focusing on a salary in terms of, the roles, the responsibilities, what you can contribute, your professional background. All of those things are great talking points and great justifications for why you are asking for whatever number it is that you're asking for. But there are also a lot of personal factors that come into that. So maybe you know that childcare is expensive and you need a salary that you can comfortably afford sending your kids to daycare, right? And while that is a very valid reason, that might not be something that you want to bring into a negotiation talk. So we'd say, honor your personal reasons, but focus the conversation on the professional reasons as to why you're asking for that number that you're asking for. Another thing to consider is that you might get an offer when you're still waiting for other offers. So a lot of times you'll be interviewing for multiple jobs simultaneously, and you can receive one offer, but you may have had a really great second or third round interview for another, and you're expecting that offer to come in any day. It's important that when you're negotiating, you're honest throughout the process. So never say that you have another offer if you don't have one. A lot of times an employer may ask to see that offer so that they can match it, right? So don't put yourself in a position where you can't produce that and you're not being ethical there. It's also really advised that you reach out to your first choice employer first. So if you have an offer from a company that is not your first choice, but you are hoping to get one and you've been through several interviews with another company, definitely reach out to them to inquire about, when you might hear back, to let them know that you have received another offer, and that can hopefully move the ball a little bit and get them closer to reaching out to you either way to let you know. And then it's always appropriate to ask when they might be able to make a decision. So to ask for what you want and then to wait and hear back, but to not let that process drag on indefinitely.
So after the negotiations, perhaps you have been able to get the offer up to a point that is acceptable to you. You absolutely want to ask for an updated offer letter that reflects the changed salary number and takes into account any other additional things that you were able to negotiate. If you're on the faculty job market, that might be startup funds, sabbatical time, etc. Right? So get those in writing. It's great to have a verbal commitments, but people change jobs. The person you had a verbal commitment with might go on to a different job, and then a new person comes into that role who's responsible for all of the things like startup funds, and then you don't want to have to start the conversation all over again with them. So get everything right in writing. Make sure to thank everybody who has helped you along the process, right? Whether it was somebody you did an informational interview with, whether it was HR person that you talked to, the hiring manager, other people you met with, you absolutely want to thank everybody and come across as agreeable. You might be going through multiple searches. When you're applying to jobs, you're often applying to multiple jobs, right? After you have accepted an offer, the thing that we advise doing is withdrawing from the other searches, right? Because you want to make sure if you've accepted an offer, you are actually not going to renege on it. Don't accept an offer if you think something else better might come along down the road and you're actually more interested in the other offer. It is perfectly okay to withdraw from an application or decline an offer, but make sure you are being gracious, you're actually sharing your reasons, and you're maintaining good relationship with everybody you're having a conversation with. So what are some resources? Glassdoor is a great resource, and Glassdoor offers a lot of information. You can see the salary calculator, so you can type in a lot of different things, variables like city, role, and calculate a reasonable salary. Glassdoor already also has a lot of salaries. The important thing to remember is like all of these salaries are self-reported, right? So if you're going for a really smaller organization and there are only 5 data points, Glassdoor will tell you that there isn't a whole lot of confidence in this salary. So take it with a grain of salt and try to do your own research in other types of ways. But yes, you can really drill down company salary and oftentimes even location to really find some salaries. Another great resource is Going Global. You can log into Going Global using your Penn key and password, and you can look up all of the salaries that H-1B employers have filed, right? So you can see here, I went to the H-1B OPT option. Whether you are international or not, if you wanted to get a real sense of what are some salary numbers out there, for H-1B employees, the government makes it required to make all of the H-1B applications public, and you can find those using this H-1B database in Going Global. So go into Going Global. What I've done in here is go to H-1B Plus and then type in Google. And you can see like what are some of the range of things that Google is offering for software engineer positions in San Jose versus Austin. It really allows you to see some things. Another great resource is our negotiation guide from Penn Career Services. You can check this out on our webpage. Another great resource that you all can check out is this resource called Beyond the Professoriate. It is linked on our website. It has a lot of on-demand content, so you can find content around preparing for interviews, around how to negotiate an offer letter. Penn Career Services, we have a YouTube page that has a lot of information around negotiation. So subscribe to our YouTube page so that you can get an alert whenever we upload any video.